advances in genetic technology, some of the things Michael already mentioned in the introduction, and like some of the benefits that come out of that, but also let's talk about social implications, the ethical aspects of it, and to really just raise awareness among people of the things that are happening in genetics, how it can influence their lives, and so that they can make informed decisions for themselves, for their families, and for their communities around these technologies. And so what do I mean by genetics is getting personal? It's really these technologies that might feel like they're very much in these science labs at these big institutes across the country are moving into people's lives, and they're moving into people's lives really fast. You might come across genetic testing when you're going to your doctor, maybe when you're having kids or participating in a clinical research study, but also even in the grocery store. I think entry tests you can get them online pretty easily nowadays, and then some shops will sell them, so they'll have them on the shelf. When you're going to vote, there are genetic technologies that people have been asked to vote on. An example of this is the release of genetically modified mosquitoes in Florida to combat Zika virus is one of those examples, or to combat Zika was one of those examples where people are asked to vote if they agreed or not to this plan. And in interaction with law enforcement is another kind of part where people might come across genetics in their lives. But for today, as the title kind of already alluded to, we'll be talking about genetics in the context of precision medicine. So what exactly is precision medicine? This term already came up a couple of times. So what we roughly mean by this is like, let's really think of the individual, for example, in the context of health, the patient, and look at all the different factors that play into their health. So yes, genetics and their biology here is a part of that. But also, like Sheeta, for example, already mentioned, there are stresses that are known to affect somebody's health. This can be things like their physical environment, their childhood development, their social support networks, their financial status, their social status. All these different things play into a person's health and well-being. And so when we think about it, it's important to take all these things into account. And we'll talk about some of those other kind of aspects of health in other talks today. But for me, I'll focus kind of on the genetic part. Now, before I dive into why people are getting excited about genetics and precision medicine, I do want to acknowledge a couple of things here and some of the disparities and challenges that we're facing in ensuring that these novel technologies can really reach everybody in our society. And so when I say disparity, I think we're all very aware that, for example, we think of health services, there are major disparities there of who has access to it, what type of health service you have access to. So this is one of those barriers that we need to overcome and ensure that everybody can have access to these new technologies. Another barrier, apart from just like access, is also people's trust in biomedical research. We have a history of exploitation and mistreatment of certain communities in this country. An example here is the Tuskegee syphilis study. There I could make a whole presentation just on examples, but I wanted to just highlight one to illustrate the point. This was a study you might be familiar with where Black men were listed, and they wanted to see what happens with our syphilis if we don't treat it. Even though in that 40-year period that this study was running, a treatment for syphilis was known, they did not provide that treatment to these men. And so this is one of those examples, and there's many more, that led people to really distrust and be afraid of research, and that kind of still echoes today. When I think about my own field, I'm trained in genetics and science research. In the early 20th century, the American eugenics movement came to be. And this is a movement that believed that certain people would be a burden on society, and that we really their idea was we need to minimize that. And when I say certain people, this really was a wide range of people back then. This ranged from people coming from Italy and Ireland, people, any person of color, people of the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, Jewish people, indigenous communities. I'm probably missing a couple. Really, if you want to summarize it, anybody who didn't really have that kind of Northwest European ancestry and was Protestant and relatively well off, they were all considered that they could be a burden. And especially back then, there was this really strong belief that everything could be explained by genetics. That, for example, one of these things that could be a burden is somebody being poor. They really believe that was somehow genetic and it could be inherited from one person to the other, rather than recognize that poverty is very much a social problem and falls into some of these other categories on that wheel of precision medicine. And so what they did back then were things like they restricted who can marry who to prevent any kind of traits getting mixed up. They had laws that restricted immigration, something that we still might be familiar with today. And there were forced sterilizations happening with the idea of like, we don't want certain people to reproduce and have children. And this slide I really included to say that this is not a very distant past. We still very much feel the ripples of those movements today, and they're still having to come to grips with that. Elaine Riddick here, she was a victim herself of forced sterilization, and she's a strong advocate to kind of fight for recognition and compensation for some of the victims of these movements. It's something you often see. It's very often the victims that are the strongest advocates for change and awareness. And so when you think of all these things that I just mentioned, the access problem, the distrust, the fear of medical research, you can imagine that a lot of people don't really want to participate in research. And an example I wanted to give is the Dene, or you might be familiar with them as the Navajo Nation. They, for the longest time, had a ban on genetic research in their community. They said, we don't want our community to be involved in this because we're really concerned about what that might mean for us. But they've recently kind of come back on that, because the thing that they also realize is by not participating, we might also be missing out on a lot of the benefits that genetics can bring to our community. And so they're really trying to claim a seat at the table on their own terms and to be able to participate, and that their community, even though they're concerned, that their community, that they can be involved and their own community can reap some of the benefits that these genetic technologies are bringing them. And so I've been saying genetics a lot and talking about benefits and things that people might be looking for. So let's dive into what I mean by that. So when I'm talking genetics, I'm really talking your DNA. So our DNA consists of, there's 4 components. We talked about them as letters, A, C, T, and G. And that's like, this is just a snippet, because your DNA code consists of billions of these components. And that code, you can think of it like a recipe book of life. It gives the instructions to build your cells, to make sure your cells work properly, to make sure they work together as tissues. Those tissues can form organs that need to work together properly. Your organs form organ systems. Different systems need to work. So that's why this code is pretty long, because it gives a lot of instructions on how your body works. And it's this code, together with all those social and environmental factors like your lifestyle, where you grow up, your life experiences, all of these things together make you your unique self. Now, when we look at our DNA code a bit more in detail, you'll see, when we think of us as humans, each one of us in this talk today, we share more than 99% of our DNA is identical. So we're very similar in that sense. But there are some variations, right? We are clearly not clones of each other here. And these minor variations in DNA code, so I just changed some letters here to illustrate that, some of these affect your health. And this is what precision medicine is interested in. It's like, what can we learn about those variations and how they link to a person's health and kind of their unique health profile. And so this is why people are interested in what they call genetic testing, or a way to think about this is reading that code. Can we read that code, and how can that help us in helping you with your health? Well, one thing it can do is it can solve medical mysteries. So for example, you or maybe your child has some symptoms. We don't really know what it is. It doesn't fit any known disease. Reading that code can help us maybe get an idea of what is the underlying problem here. It can predict a person's response to a medication. One example of this is codeine. Codeine is a medication that's often given after, for example, a surgery. It's to deal with pain. And for a lot of people, that codeine at the regular dose works absolutely fine. But for some people, and this is known to be linked to, again, those variations in DNA code, codeine doesn't really work. They're not getting any pain relief. And for another group of people, taking codeine can actually be lethal. And so if you fall in any of those categories where it either doesn't work or it can be dangerous for you to take codeine, this is something that can be read in your DNA code. and you might want to just change what type of pain medication you take to kind of mitigate that. Now, one big reason why people are interested in reading their genetic code is to see if they're at risk of any diseases in their future. One example of that is HCM, or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a disease where there's an enlargement in your heart muscle. And that, again, there are, I think they've figured out about a dozen, up to 20, I think, variants in your DNA that can link to that and determine that risk. And a lot of people can live with that perfectly fine, and they might not even realize ever in their lives that they have this. But there are some people for who this can be dangerous, especially when you get your heart going, then that heart muscle has some problems, like in sports, or maybe, I don't know, moving some heavy furniture around. That can really cause some problems. And the reason I wanted to bring this specific example up of HCM is for something we talked about earlier, and something that both Shanita and Michael have already mentioned, which is this participation in genetic research and why it's so crucial. So for HCM, we know there are some factors in the DNA code that play a role there. But to really understand fully how that works and how that interacts, we need to do research. And people have been working and studying HCM, but something that was recently discovered is that actually a lot of people have been misdiagnosed, where it was thought that, well, they were told they had HCM, even though they didn't. And that can be devastating. Imagine you are an athlete, you want to make your career out of it, you're told you have HCM, so you're advised to stop doing your sport, even though you might not have HCM at all. And the reason that these misdiagnoses happen is because the majority of research around HCM, and this goes for a lot of other traits and diseases people are looking at, is the majority of research is done on people who are generally white men. And the issue with that is that you don't get the full picture, the diverse picture that's out there. And so we don't have a full picture of which genetic factors are really important for HCM, which ones are not. And that's what's causing some of these misdiagnoses problems that can have very big consequences for people. And so that's why it's so important to get a more diverse people interested in participating in research, and also from the researcher perspective to really educate researchers they need to get a diverse population when they're doing their research, which is happening more and more. And again, I think Shanita showed us the All of Us, I think was on one of her slides, is one of those initiatives to kind of encourage a more diverse research population. Another reason people might want to look at disease risk is cancer. To be aware, even before you have any type of cancer, if you're aware that if you screen your DNA, read your DNA, you might become aware that you have some of those risk factors. And some of those things can be mitigated. You can take preventative medical decisions. You can change your lifestyle that can mitigate some of the problems. And even when you do develop a form of cancer, by understanding the genetics of that cancer, you can have personalized treatments that work for you specifically. Because cancers, again, there's lots of different variations in that code that feed into your risk of cancer and your type of cancer. So really having an understanding that means we can design treatments that work for you personally. And that's really what precision medicine is hoping to achieve. So one last thing I wanted to talk about with respect to genetics and these new technologies coming out is that all of what I just mentioned is about reading your DNA code, understanding your code, understanding how it can affect your health, and acting on that information. The next step people are taking already, and is even happening in the clinic, still in trials, but moving fast into possibly being an option available to a lot of people, is the idea of changing somebody's DNA code, right? So we know that genetic diseases there's something in the code, some variants that are linked to that. So the thinking is, can we make a change to the code, really get to the core of some of these diseases rather than just mitigating the symptoms? So this is exactly what Michael was mentioning in his introduction. CRISPR is one of those tools that can do this, what they call genome editing, making changes to the DNA code. And kind of a key disease that's really at the forefront of this type of research is sickle cell disease, which is something that's found all across the globe. though a little bit more common in people from certain regions in Africa, but also like the Mediterranean, south of Europe, the Arab Peninsula, Southeast Asia. And this affects people's red blood cells and how well they can carry oxygen around their bodies. And so the women you see on the slide here are Victoria Gray at the top. She was the very first patient ever to get CRISPR treatment for sickle cell. And this down here, this younger lady, she's Helen Obondu. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her name correct. They're both some of the first patients. She's actually the youngest patient ever treated. And what it meant for them is that the reason sickle cell is at the forefront is because it's really unique. And it's unique in that there's only a single letter change in that code that decides whether you have sickle cell or you don't. That's pretty unique. Most traits involve lots of different parts in our DNA. Sickle cell is just one letter. And because it's so relatively simple in that sense, this is why it became such a candidate for CRISPR and this idea of genome editing. And so what they did in these women has changed their lives. They both were people who before had to like go to the hospital on a monthly basis for blood transfusion, have very painful crises because their muscles weren't getting enough oxygen, things like that. All those symptoms have all but disappeared for them after receiving this genome editing. So this is bringing hope for a lot of people that are dealing with genetic diseases. And so with that, I hope I've given you a bit of a feel for why people are getting really excited about these new developments in genetics, the hope they bring to people, but also to look at the bigger picture again of genetics just being one slice of all these other factors that play into health, and that we really, need to make sure that we deal with some of those barriers and make sure that all these technologies really can become available to anybody that would potentially benefit from them. And so with that, I thank you all for having me here today, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see you again.